When I first settled into the cabin my grandfather built nestled deep within the northern ridge of Westridge County, I never imagined I'd be at war with the Homeowners Association. Back then, the idea of any bureaucratic drama reaching this far up into the trees felt laughable. The nearest cul-de-sac was nearly a mile downhill, and my deed yellowed and folded in a lockbox under the floorboards dated back to before the HOA even existed. This mountain was in my blood. It was the only place where I felt I could finally breathe again after retiring from 32 years as a geological engineer, half of which I spent deployed for disaster assessment with the National Guard. My name is Franklin Hale. I'm 61 years old, divorced, childless, and I suppose to some people that makes me look like an easy target. A solitary old man living in the woods with a beard and a dog named Jasper. But make no mistake, I know every inch of this land better than the people who tried to take it from me. And I knew long before they did that their arrogance was going to cost them dearly. The trouble began slowly, like the first distant rumble of thunder on a clear day. In the early days of my retirement, I'd spend mornings watching the fog lift off the trees, with a thermos of black coffee in one hand and Jasper curled at my feet. I took care of the trails myself, built my own well system, ran solar panels off a quiet ridge where the wind wouldn't catch them. I lived off-grid, but not in defiance of society, just in quiet preference. Then came the HOA newsletters. They started showing up stuffed into my mailbox, glossy paper, full of new developments, playground upgrades, and plans to improve community connectivity through trail extensions. It was worded like progress, like unity. But to me, it was a red flag. The trail extensions they were talking about, they would require carving directly into the eastern slope of my property. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. I had never signed anything that subjected my land to HOA oversight. My property sat just outside the original HOA boundary, and my grandfather had made sure of that when he bought the land in 1958. But over the decades, the HOA had expanded like ivy, slow, invasive, and unrelenting. I walked the ridgeline with Jasper that afternoon, my boots crunching across familiar stones. That particular section of the mountain was fragile, not just sentimentally, but structurally. I'd mapped the faults beneath it myself years ago during a private consulting contract with the State Geological Department. Underneath the soil sat a latticework of fractured bedrock and ancient landslide zones, long dormant but never secure. Anyone who knew how to read a topographic map would know better than to dig there. But HOA presidents don't read maps, they read budgets and imagine ribbon cuttings. I wrote a letter, polite, firm. I explained the geological risks, attached scanned copies of the 1986 fault assessment, and mailed it certified to the HOA office and the county zoning department. Then I waited. Weeks passed. The only reply I got was another newsletter. This time, the language was even more pointed. It said the Community Trail Expansion Project had been approved unanimously by the board. It praised local efforts to create shared spaces for future generations. And then it listed the construction schedule. Excavation was set to begin in July. I stared at that line for a long time. I could almost feel my grandfather's voice in my ear, that dry drawl he had when someone was being foolish. "Give 'em rope, Frank," he used to say. "They'll hang themselves twice." The first bulldozer showed up on July 3rd. I heard it before I saw it, a mechanical groan echoing through the valley, foreign and grating. Jasper barked and bolted toward the ridge. I followed, heart-pounding in disbelief. Sure enough, there it was, yellow paint, fresh tracks, and a driver in a reflective vest scanning a clipboard like he owned the place. I called out. He looked up startled and shut down the engine. I could tell he wasn't the decision-maker, just a contractor. He pointed me down to a white SUV parked at the base of the slope. That's where I met her. Pamela Voss, HOA president. Tall, perfectly pressed khakis and sunglasses that never left her face. She smiled at me like I was a neighbor stopping by with banana bread. "Mr. Hale," she said, extending a hand I didn't take. "So glad you came down. We're finally making progress up here." "You're trespassing," I said. Her smile didn't flinch. "Oh, I don't think so. This section is part of the community expansion zone now. It was voted on at the last meeting." "I didn't attend that meeting," I said flatly, "because this isn't your jurisdiction. This is private land. It's mine." She waved vaguely at the mountain. "It's complicated." "No," I said, "it's really not. That was the moment I knew I wasn't dealing with miscommunication. I was dealing with entitlement wrapped in polyester. Pamela wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in legacy hers. A park with her name on a plaque. A ribbon cut in front of photographers. She didn't care about fault lines or erosion. She cared about optics. I told her to leave. She told me to contact the board if I had concerns. And then she got back in her SUV and drove away, leaving her machinery sitting on my land. That night, I sat on my porch and listened to the wind rustling through the trees. Jasper lay beside me, ears twitching. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept returning to that patch of earth they were about to disturb. If they kept digging, the consequences wouldn't just be bureaucratic. They would be geological and unforgiving. I lit the first lantern of the summer and pulled out my grandfather's journal. If they were going to drag me into a war, I wasn't coming unarmed. I spent the next week poring over maps, deed records, geological surveys, and the original boundary paperwork my grandfather kept stored in a weatherproof lockbox under the cabin. Every document confirmed the same thing: my land was not part of the HOA. Never had been. Never would be unless I voluntarily signed it over. And I never had. That was the end of the legal debate, as far as I was concerned. But if there's one thing I've learned from decades dealing with bureaucracies, it's this: just because something is true doesn't mean people will accept it, especially when it gets in the way of their ambition. The next newsletter made my stomach churn. Printed across the glossy back page was a full-color rendering of the Westridge Nature Connection, a looping series of hiking and biking trails that would wind through the back of the neighborhood up past the creek, and there it was, right across my eastern ridge. They'd even named it Voss Peak Path, like Pamela had already claimed it for herself. I stood in the kitchen holding the paper mouth dry. Jasper tilted his head as if sensing something was off. I dropped the newsletter on the counter and walked outside, letting the screen door slam shut behind me. From my porch, I could see the slope they were targeting: a steep grade, with loose scree and fractured soil. A fool's project. And yet, they were treating it like a PR campaign. That night, I drove down the hill into town. Westridge wasn't large: a grocery store, a post office, a diner, and the HOA administrative building tucked in a strip mall between a real estate office and a boutique pet spa. I parked my truck out front and walked in with a manila folder under my arm, filled with all the proof they should need. The woman behind the front desk looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with Pamela Voss," I said. She gave me a tight smile. "President Voss is in a board meeting. I can take a message." "It's urgent," I interrupted. Before she could argue, the glass door behind her opened, and Pamela stepped out, smoothing her blazer and holding a coffee cup like she was starring in a political ad. Her eyes flicked over to me, and for a split second I saw the flicker of annoyance. Then the smile came back. "Mr. Hale," she said, like we were old friends bumping into each other at the market. "I wasn't expecting you." "I brought something for you," I said, holding out the folder. She took it with feigned curiosity and flipped through the contents: copies of my property deed, the 1986 geotechnical survey, the county's most recent zoning map, with my parcel clearly marked outside the HOA's jurisdiction. She didn't even finish looking through it before she said, "Well, I'm sure the board will be happy to review all of this." "Review isn't necessary," I said. "It's clear. You're trespassing. Stop the project before someone gets hurt." Pamela's smile thinned. "Mr. Hale, I understand your concerns, but we've already invested in the preliminary infrastructure. The trails are meant to benefit the entire community. You live here too, don't you?" "I live on my mountain," I said. "That's not the same thing." She handed the folder back without taking her eyes off me. "Thank you for your input." Input. That word echoed in my ears as I walked back to my truck. It wasn't input. It was a warning. And they weren't going to listen. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more signs of preparation: survey markers placed along my property line, pink flags fluttering on stakes like invaders planting their claim. Pickup trucks with landscaping logos began showing up along the lower trailhead. I took photos, logged license plates, and I waited. At the diner one morning, I overheard a conversation between two HOA board members, Greg Parsons and Tina Morales. They didn't recognize me, even though we'd shared sidewalks for years. "I heard they want to build a lookout deck on the ridge," Tina said between bites of toast. "Pamela's already talking to donors." "That mountain guy's gonna flip." Greg chuckled. "You think he'll sue?" Let him. The HOA's got lawyers for that. I didn't say a word. I paid for my coffee and left. But something shifted in me that day. It was no longer about property lines. This was about control, about people in power steamrolling anyone who dared stand in their way. I had seen it before in my military career. This was just a civilian version wrapped in pleasantries and paper trails. Still, I tried to do things the right way. I filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board, submitted my documentation, geotechnical concerns, and historical land ownership. I even included a highlighted copy of the original land plat. They thanked me for bringing it to their attention and promised a review within 60 business days. 60 days. At mountain elevation, 60 days could mean 3 rain cycles. It could mean the difference between minor erosion and a catastrophic slide. I called an old colleague from my National Guard days, Eric Ramirez, now working with the state's Department of Environmental Quality. He owed me a favor, and I cashed it in. I sent him drone photos of the terrain, the excavation markers, and the HOA's planned path. He called me 2 days later. Frank, he said, that slope is unstable. If they dig there and we get even moderate rainfall, it'll move. Can you issue a formal warning? I can write an advisory, he said carefully, but enforcement has to come from local jurisdiction unless it's a state-level hazard. And for that, we'd need proof of activity and intent. I'm working on it, I told him. And I was. I set up motion-triggered trail cams along the edge of the ridge and began collecting daily footage. Every rock moved, every stake driven, every vehicle that rolled through, I had it logged. Still, the pace accelerated. Pamela held community vision sessions, spinning the project as a unifying trail for all residents, even though the HOA's reach had never legally included the mountain. Families showed up with kids and strollers posing for mock ribbon cuttings on land they didn't own. I stood at the tree line and watched it all from a distance. Jasper growled low beside me, and I knelt to rest my hand on his back. "I know, boy," I whispered. "They're building on lies. But nature doesn't care about politics. And it sure as hell doesn't care about HOA dreams." It happened early one morning before the sun had even cleared the ridge. I was out chopping wood near the back slope when Jasper let out a sharp, uneasy bark. Not his usual alert, this one was lower, more guttural. I turned and followed his gaze. Through the thin veil of pine branches, I saw them 2 backhoes, their yellow arms rising like mechanical beasts against the pale sky, crawling up the incline of my land. The sound of metal on stone sent a pulse of heat through my chest. They were digging. Not surveying, not measuring, digging. I left the axe where it was and walked briskly toward the slope, my boots crunching over brittle needles and loose earth. By the time I reached the ridge, the crews had already begun carving into the upper trail, the one that veered dangerously close to the fractured shale formation I'd tried to warn them about. A man in a reflective vest looked up as I approached. I didn't recognize him, probably a subcontractor no more invested in this place than the diesel in his tank. "Hey," I called, raising my voice above the engine whine. "Cut it, you're trespassing." He hesitated, then turned off the machine. Dust settled. From the far side of the slope, a woman in a bright pink windbreaker emerged, clipboard in hand. Pamela, of course. Her ponytail bounced with each smug step. "Mr. Hale," she said brightly, as though we were old friends meeting on a neighborhood stroll. "Glad you could stop by. I was hoping we'd run into each other." "You're on my land," I said, voice flat. "You need to shut this down now." She gestured with the clipboard. "Actually, this is part of the revised access route. The board approved the new alignment last week." "And I didn't," I said, "because I'm not on your board. Because this land doesn't belong to your HOA." She gave me a tight smile like a teacher humoring a child. "You're within the scenic corridor, Franklin. The HOA has a responsibility to maintain continuity between all community spaces." "Scenic corridor," I barked a laugh. "You think slapping buzzwords on a bulldozer gives you jurisdiction? This is deeded private property." Pamela waved her clipboard. "We've reviewed the surveys." I stepped forward closer than was polite. I was a geological engineer for 32 years. I did the surveys. And if you keep cutting into this slope, you're going to trigger a slide that'll bury everything downhill, including those houses you claim to be connecting. Her expression faltered just slightly. Then she squared her shoulders. "We've had independent consultants review the terrain. It's stable." "No, it's not," I said. "And when it fails, you'll have more than a trespassing suit on your hands." Pamela turned and waved a hand in the air. "Let's take a quick break," she told the crew. "Give Mr. Hale some space." The machines fell silent. The men lit cigarettes or leaned against their equipment. None of them looked at me. I knew that look meant doing a job they didn't want to understand. Letting the boss take the fall when it went sideways. Pamela faced me again. "We're not your enemy." "You're not my neighbor either," I replied. "You're a corporation hiding behind flower beds and newsletters." She didn't answer that. Just offered me a final smile and walked back toward her SUV, where a young assistant was already tapping notes into a tablet. Within minutes, the engines roared back to life. The hillside trembled again. I stood there for a long time. Then I turned, walked back to the cabin, and pulled out my grandfather's old camcorder, the one he used to document his land every season. A habit he passed down to me like firewood stacking and trout cleaning. I charged the battery-packed extra tapes and hiked back up. That afternoon, I recorded everything. Not just wide shots of the digging, but close-ups of the equipment crossing my boundary lines, time-stamped footage of the soil displacement footage of the red flags marking unstable zones being ignored. I narrated every step, every document I referenced, every moment they violated the topography. That night, I downloaded the files to 3 separate drives. I mailed one to Eric Ramirez at the state office. Another went to a contact at the local news station. The third I hid in a fireproof safe under the porch. They wanted to play games fine. I had patience and evidence. The next morning, things escalated. A notice appeared on my cabin door, laminated zip-tied to the handle. HOA letterhead big and bold. It cited a list of supposed violations, unauthorized fencing non-conforming solar installations, and unapproved land use practices. I laughed out loud when I read it. The solar panels they cited were on a shed built 20 years before the HOA even existed. The fencing hand-built from pine felled during a 1997 storm. Nothing in their notice held legal weight, but that wasn't the point. It was about intimidation. They were letting me know if I pushed back, they'd push harder. That same day, I received a voicemail from a man named Craig Lanning, the HOA's legal counsel. His voice was soft, rehearsed, slippery. "Mr. Hale, I understand you've expressed some concerns about the community project underway near your property. I'd like to invite you to a discussion with the board to clarify boundaries and reach a mutual understanding. Of course, we hope to avoid any unnecessary legal steps." I didn't return the call. Instead, I typed a formal cease and desist letter citing my property deed, legal code references, and federal protections concerning unauthorized development on private terrain. I sent it via certified mail to the HOA office, Pamela Voss, personally, and the county recorder's office. Still, the digging continued. That week, I heard dynamite. Not a massive blast, just small charges likely to break apart rocky outcroppings. But the sound sent a jolt down my spine. They were getting reckless. I checked the trail cams that night. The footage showed a man placing what looked like small detonators along a ridge barely 100 yards from the old shale fault. I emailed the video to Eric immediately. His reply was short: "They're out of their minds. I'm escalating this." The days blurred after that, dust clouds rising each morning, engines buzzing like hornets on the hill. I stopped sleeping well, kept waking up in the middle of the night to check for landslide tremors, even when the air was still. Pamela stopped coming in person. She sent underlings, now clipboard carriers, and surveyors who didn't make eye contact when I passed them in the woods. They knew. Somewhere deep down, they knew what they were doing was wrong. But they were already too far in. The machinery had momentum now. Budgets had been spent. Names had been promised. And the sky above it all was starting to shift. The first storm rolled in on a Thursday afternoon, not more than a drizzle, but enough to paint the air with the scent of pine sap and damp soil. I was on the ridge, checking the stakes they'd driven into the slope, and the crumbling path their machines had left behind when I felt it. Not a quake, not yet, just a shift. A subtle flex under my boot. I crouched down, ran my hand across the loose shale. The soil was damp fine like powder. They'd exposed the underlayer by carving too deep, too wide. Rainwater was seeping into places it hadn't touched in decades, into sediment that wasn't meant to hold weight, especially not under the constant crush of bulldozers and dump trucks. I went back to the cabin and dug out my old seismic logs, handwritten, carefully notated, dating back to the early 90s, when I'd first started monitoring this part of the mountain. My grandfather had always said it breathed. He was right. It shifted seasonally, small expansions, contractions, microfractures forming and sealing with the snowmelt. But now they'd broken its skin. That night, thunder rolled over the valley. The kind that doesn't boom but crackles and lingers. The kind that sounds like something splintering just out of sight. I stayed up late reviewing old contour maps, drinking bad coffee, and rewatching the footage I'd captured from the ridge. The ground was whispering, and I was the only one listening. The next morning, I put on my field jacket, printed 2 sets of geological reports, and hiked down the trail into HOA territory. Jasper followed close, his tail-rigid body alert. The clouds were thick, pregnant with the threat of real rain. When I reached the main construction site, I spotted Pamela, standing under a white canopy tent with 2 other board members, Greg Parsons and Tina Morales, sipping coffee like this was a picnic. Workers in hard hats moved about like ants below them, packing earth, adjusting scaffolding along a wooden frame they'd started building into the slope. I walked straight up. Pamela raised her sunglasses without smiling. "Mr. Hale, another visit." I handed her the folder. "You need to stop. You're destabilizing a known fault line." Tina scoffed before even opening it. "We've had our engineers review everything. There's no indication." "They're not geologists," I cut in. "They're civil contractors. You're asking a house painter to diagnose a brain tumor." Greg tried to take the folder from Pamela, but she clutched it. "We appreciate your passion, Mr. Hale, but the board has already approved the project. You've had your say." "No," I said, taking a breath. "You've heard my words. You haven't understood the consequences." I pointed up at the ridge. "That line of rock you're digging into, it was classified as a high-risk slide zone in the 1986 State Survey. The same one your consultants conveniently ignored. I worked that survey. I know exactly what happens when you overload that ridge with water." Greg laughed under his breath. "So you're predicting what, an avalanche?" "A landslide," I replied coldly. "A deep-seated rotational slide. It won't happen fast, not right away. But with every inch of soil you loosen, every gallon of rain we get, you're inviting it. And when it comes, you won't just lose your trail. You'll lose everything below it. Trees, foundations, maybe even lives." Tina's face paled just for a second. Pamela pursed her lips. "You're fear-mongering, Mr. Hale. And this," she waved the folder, "isn't a legal injunction. You have no authority here." "I have knowledge," I said, "and the clock is ticking." She handed the folder back untouched. "You're dismissed." It wasn't the first time I'd been dismissed in my life. The military has a way of teaching you to live with bureaucracy. But this was different. This wasn't red tape. This was arrogance stitched into every thread of power, the belief that progress excuses destruction. I returned home and called Eric again. His voice was grim. "I reviewed your new footage," he said, "and cross-checked your fault readings with updated state data. You're right. They're inside the critical risk zone. If we get even a moderate rainfall, and the models show an 80% chance of a 3-day front moving in next week, it could fail." "Can you stop them?" I asked. "I'm trying," he said. "I've pushed it up to the Regional Emergency Planning Office, but enforcement depends on zoning jurisdiction. Your county's slow and, politically, complicated." "Complicated how?" "The HOA president is married to the deputy county supervisor," he said quietly. Of course she was. That night, I wrote letters, not emails, letters. Physical signed copies sent to the county commissioners, to local news outlets, to the Regional Environmental Protection Board. I included copies of footage, geological maps, and even testimony from retired state geologists I'd served with. Still, the digging didn't stop. Pamela doubled down. She issued a statement in the HOA newsletter calling me a local resident with a long history of obstructing community development and spreading scientifically unfounded alarmism. They called me a kook, a cranky mountain man with too much time and too many conspiracy theories. So I did what mountain men do. I watched, I listened, and I waited for the rain. It arrived 4 days later. Not a storm, not yet. Just steady, persistent water. Sheets of it sliding down the bark of ancient trees. The air turned heavy, the ground slick. I checked the cams hourly. The footage showed runoff pooling near the excavation zone streams, cutting channels through soft earth. I saw the first fissure open just before midnight, a hairline crack in the slope near the highest dig site. By morning, it had widened by 3 inches. That evening, I drove into town and delivered a USB drive to the local news station. I left it at the front desk with a note that read, "If anything happens to me or this mountain, play this." When I got home, I sat on the porch with Jasper beside me, watching the clouds roll in thick and gray. The mountain was quiet, not in peace, but in anticipation. The kind of silence that comes before something breaks. And break it would. The next morning, before I'd even had a chance to finish my first cup of coffee, a black SUV with tinted windows rolled up my gravel drive. It didn't have plates, just a tag that said HOA admin. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Jasper growled low and paced beside the porch railing. I stood up slowly and set my mug down on the banister, watching the vehicle come to a stop in front of the cabin. Two men in suits stepped out, one tall with a tightly knotted red tie, the other younger hair slicked back like he thought he was in a courtroom drama. They looked out of place among the pine trees, like they'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a corporate retreat. The tall one approached first, Mr. Franklin Hale. I nodded. He extended a manila envelope. "You've been served." I didn't take it. Instead, I let the moment hang there, thick as the morning fog. "What am I being served for?" The younger one spoke up. "Cease and desist, defamation, obstruction of development, interference with HOA operations. If you continue to spread false geological claims and harass the construction crew, the HOA reserves the right to pursue damages." I stared at them, not a flicker of shame in their eyes. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You dig into a known fault zone on land that doesn't belong to you. Ignore every warning, and now you're threatening me because I'm telling the truth." The tall man shifted. "You're not a licensed geologist anymore, Mr. Hale. Your certifications are expired, your data is unverified, and your accusations are creating unnecessary panic among residents." My fingers curled into fists. Jasper barked sharply, one loud, aggressive warning, and both men stepped back. "Good dog." I took the envelope at last, not because I accepted it, but because I wanted to know exactly how far they were willing to go. "Tell Pamela I hope she's enjoying the view while it lasts," I said. They didn't reply, just turned, got back into their vehicle, and disappeared down the winding trail like ghosts in tailored suits. Inside, I opened the envelope at my kitchen table. The letter was printed on thick, expensive paper. Standard legal intimidation tactics, reputational harm, loss of projected community value, unsubstantiated claims. They'd even attached screenshots of my public posts in the Westridge Community Forum, where I'd shared maps, rain forecasts, and stills from my trail cameras. One of the board members had apparently flagged them as misinformation. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so dangerous. They were setting me up as the scapegoat, so when the mountain came down, they could say I had incited panic, sabotaged their work, or worst of all, lied. But the mountain doesn't lie. And it was starting to shift. The rain hadn't let up for 3 days. According to the gauge I kept by the tool shed, we were at just over 6.2 inches. Saturation point on that slope, according to my calculations and past incidents, was around 7.4. I called Eric again. "They're threatening legal action," I said. He sighed into the phone. "They're bluffing. If they had a case, they'd go through the county attorney, not drop a cease and desist with vague accusations. They're just trying to silence me," I said. "Then don't be silent," he replied, "but be careful." That night, I got a phone call from someone I didn't expect. Her name was Janet Fowler, a retired teacher, former HOA member. She had served on the board 6 years ago before Pamela Voss took over. She'd heard about the construction through the community grapevine and found my number through mutual friends at the local library. "I believe you, Mr. Hale," she said. Those 4 words hit me harder than I expected. I sat down on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed to my ear. "Thank you," I said. "I remember when that land was donated to the county as a protected slope. It was supposed to remain untouched. But Pamela changed the charter 2 years ago, redrew boundaries, classified the ridge as unused green space. That's how they got their foot in." "She redrew it illegally," I said. "Maybe," Janet said. "But unless you prove it in court or get media coverage, they'll keep digging." I paused. "Would you be willing to say that on record?" She hesitated. "Then yes, I've kept everything. Minutes, emails, even some of her texts." After I hung up, I didn't sleep. I spent the night organizing a packet of every document, photo recording, and camera log I had. I built a timeline clear, unshakable, undeniable. Then I printed it out and drove down into town the next morning, rain hammering the windshield like warning taps from something ancient and angry above us. At the Westridge Town Hall, I met with a journalist from the local paper, Melissa Chan. She was young, sharp, and skeptical at first. But as I walked her through the evidence, her brow furrowed deeper and deeper. "You have actual fault line data?" she asked. "Yes." "And you warned them before construction began?" "Twice, documented." She looked up. "Do you think it'll collapse?" I met her eyes. "I don't think," I said. "I know." She ran the story 3 days later. Front page. Mountain at risk. Ignores warnings from retired geologist. The fallout was immediate. My inbox exploded. Some residents were furious, accusing me of fear-mongering. Others reached out in private thanking me, asking questions, wondering why Pamela had never mentioned the geologic risks in the board meetings. Pamela, of course, issued a rebuttal. She called the article reckless journalism and reiterated her confidence in the safety of the project. She held a press conference from beneath the canopy tent, standing beside Greg and Tina, smiling like a politician during a scandal. But you could see it in her eyes. She was sweating. Because the ground beneath her was no longer solid. I knew it. And so did the mountain. By the 4th day of rain, the mountain had changed its voice. It no longer whispered. It groaned. The kind of sound that seeps up through your boots and into your spine, a deep, wet pressure that told anyone paying attention that something below was giving way. The streams that trickled across the slope now flowed with fury. Water carved new paths through fragile shale and loosened boulders I hadn't seen move in decades. Trees leaned at angles that made my stomach twist. I didn't need a seismograph to know we were close. I spent the morning hiking to my upper trail cam, the one perched directly above the excavation site. I'd tied it to a birch trunk just high enough to capture a wide-angle view. When I reached it, I noticed that the tree itself had started to tilt only slightly, but enough that the camera now faced downward toward a sharp drop of exposed rock. I retrieved the footage anyway, tucked the card in my vest pocket, and took the long way back down, cutting through the woods along a path only Jasper and I knew. That night, I watched the playback with a gnawing sense of dread. The footage showed trucks sloshing through standing water tires, sinking in mud up to the hubs. Workers used makeshift planks to cross soggy terrain. But worse, far worse, was the footage of the ridge itself. A vertical split had opened behind the main retaining wall, only about 4 feet tall and maybe 3 inches wide. But to someone who understands terrain failure, it might as well have been a glowing red countdown. They were building into an open wound. At dawn, I made my way down to the town hall again, not with documents this time, but with the footage burned onto a flash drive, labeled in red marker, 72-hour risk. I didn't ask for an appointment. I barged into the zoning office with my boots dripping and demanded to see the director, a balding man named Richard Travers, who had avoided my emails for weeks. To his credit, he sat me down. "Richard Weiss said you need to issue a stop order immediately. There's visible shearing. The retaining wall is buckling. If we get more rain tonight, that slope's going to move." He looked tired, overwhelmed. "Frank, I don't doubt your expertise, but legally the HOA has permits. The inspection logs don't show anything catastrophic." "Because you're using the wrong inspectors," I snapped. "You sent out someone with a clipboard and a checklist. I'm telling you that structurally, the entire east face of that slope is collapsing under saturation. And it's not just a trail that'll go down. If the fault slips, it could wipe out 3 backyards and the northern access road." He rubbed his temples. "I'll escalate it." "Don't escalate it," I said. "Act on it." But I knew how politics worked. If he acted too soon and the slide didn't happen, he'd be the one blamed for halting development. If he waited and disaster struck, he could pin it on unforeseen circumstances. They were gambling with time, and time was running out. That evening, Melissa Chan published a follow-up article. Video evidence suggests unstable conditions on HOA project site. She embedded the trail cam footage directly into the article, zoomed in on the vertical crack. She quoted Eric Ramirez, who had reviewed the footage, and publicly confirmed the immediate risk of terrain displacement. Pamela was furious. She called a closed-door HOA board meeting and barred non-members from attending. Still whispers trickled out. A landscaper who had quit the site texted Melissa an anonymous tip. "They're building retaining walls overnight. Quiet. No paper trail. Trying to hide it." And that's when the panic set in. I began seeing HOA board members' cars coming and going late into the night. Construction lights flickered along the ridge after midnight. Greg Parsons posted a frantic message in the community forum, insisting that the trail remain safe, and the project is ahead of schedule. But the comments below told a different story. Why does my backyard smell like wet clay? There's a new crack in my basement wall. Anyone else seeing this? We had a minor slide in the lower trail path. No injuries, but something's off. The HOA started deleting comments. People started screenshotting them. Pamela released a pre-recorded video the next morning, standing under the same white canopy, with a serene background of pine trees and fog. She spoke of weather-related challenges and rumors designed to disrupt progress. She smiled, always smiled. But her voice wavered when she mentioned recent concerns expressed by a former resident geologist. Former. She kept saying that word like it stripped me of truth. But truth doesn't expire. That afternoon, I walked the ridge one last time before dark. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the clouds overhead were still bloated with weight. I paused at a high bluff overlooking the excavation site. From here, I could see the whole disaster in waiting: the gaping fault scar, the leaning equipment, the patchwork walls slapped together with panic. And then I heard it. A crack. Sharp, short, like a bone snapping in the cold. I dropped to my knees, pressed a hand to the earth. It vibrated, not a tremor yet, but a strain. The kind of tension that precedes surrender. I stood up slowly, turned to leave, and saw Pamela. She had come up the slope alone, probably to prove something to someone. She looked soaked, breathless face, blotched with cold and exertion. Her eyes met mine. "What are you doing up here?" she demanded. "I could ask you the same." She gestured vaguely behind her. "Just checking on the site, making sure things are stable." I almost laughed. "Stable? You shouldn't even be up here. I've walked this mountain since I was a child, Mr. Hale. This mountain isn't your playground. It's a living body, and you've been sawing at its knees." She opened her mouth to reply, but then there was another crack, louder this time. We both froze. A cascade of loose gravel tumbled from the slope below, like marbles spilling downstairs. Pamela took a step back. "We need to leave," I said. She hesitated just long enough to make me question whether pride could actually kill. Then she turned and followed me down the slope in silence. Back at my cabin, I stayed up all night listening. The wind howled through the pine. Rain ticked like teeth against the roof. And deep beneath it all, the mountain groaned again, louder, slower, more certain. Tomorrow it would fall. The morning was unnaturally still. After days of relentless rain, the world outside my window looked drenched in silver. The sky held a pale, eerie tone. Not quite dawn, not quite storm. Just a thick breath of silence before something irreversible. Jasper whined low, from the corner ears flattened, as if he too could sense it. The rain resumed at 7:43 a.m. Not a drizzle this time, a wall of water. It slammed against the roof like fists, not drops. I watched as runoff instantly overwhelmed the culverts, spilling into the slope below like veins rupturing. Trees that had stood for generations were now glistening in the downpour, roots exposed and trembling. Then came the rumble. It started at 9:14 a.m., low and deep, like thunder trapped inside the earth. I froze. My mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the cabin floor. Jasper was already barking, frantic pacing in tight circles as the groan beneath us swelled. I ran. Up the ridge, boots sliding in, mud camera in hand. I needed to see it documented, not for vindication, not even for the lawsuit I knew would come, but because I'd warned them. And if the mountain was going to scream, someone had to bear witness. The ridge was chaos. Water poured in torrents down freshly cut scars. The retaining wall, their last desperate attempt at control, cracked open with a sound like ripping steel. Then everything let go. I watched as the slope shifted slow at first, like a giant exhaling. Then came the roar. Earth tore loose in wide, angry strips. Trees were wrenched from the soil, dragged into a spiral of mud and stone that raced downhill like an avalanche of black clay. A yellow backhoe left parked near the fault line vanished as the ground beneath it liquefied. The wooden frame of their so-called trail bent and folded like a toy bridge. And in the middle of it all, like a queen without her throne, stood Pamela Voss. She had arrived earlier, probably to manage optics again. Her white SUV was parked not far from the canopy tent, which was now shredded and flailing like a dead sail. She stood frozen, mouth open, unable to process what she was seeing. "Get out!" I screamed from across the ridge. "Run!" She stumbled back, slipping on the mud, catching herself on a tree trunk. Greg and Tina came into view behind her eyes wide in terror, both of them soaked and speechless. But the slide didn't care about terror. It moved fast now, a black tongue of destruction, licking its way through everything man-made. I saw the lower footbridge snap in half. A storage trailer rolled like a tin can. The ground kept opening, kept swallowing. Pamela bolted, then barefoot shoes lost in the mire. Tina screamed. Greg dropped to his knees. I kept the camera rolling, hands shaking, documenting it all from a ledge I had mapped decades ago, one of the few that remained structurally sound. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had once told the county to preserve this ledge as a possible emergency overlook during rockslide season. They had laughed at me. Now it was the last safe spot left standing. The slide lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Long enough for half a mountain face to reconfigure itself. Long enough to wipe away 7 months of unauthorized construction. Long enough for the HOA's lies to become buried under the very land they thought they owned. And then came the quiet again. That post-collapse silence. It's unlike any other. It doesn't hum. It waits, as if the mountain itself is assessing what it's done, asking, "Did I say enough this time?" I lowered the camera. The entire eastern slope was unrecognizable. Mud-stained equipment jutted out like fossils. The Voss Peak path was gone, as if it had never existed. I made my way down, carefully calling for help on the emergency radio. The HOA had never filed for geological monitoring, so they had no emergency protocols in place. No alert systems, no slide warnings, no evacuation plan. All of it had been deemed unnecessary expenses by the board. Now the board sat on the ground, shaking, drenched, defeated. Pamela's khakis were black with sludge. Her hair was matted to her face. She didn't speak when I approached. Her eyes red, and blinking rain found mine not in anger, but in a kind of pleading disbelief, like she couldn't accept what the earth had done. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The mountain had spoken loud enough for both of us. The fire department arrived an hour later, followed by the county sheriff and a news crew from Channel 4. They asked for statements. I gave mine calmly, factually. I handed over the footage. Melissa Chan arrived on site shortly after, hair covered in a rain hood, eyes wide as she took in the devastation. "You were right," she said. "I wasn't trying to be," I replied. Pamela and the others were checked by medics. No one died. A miracle. But 5 nearby homes sustained structural damage. 2 families had to evacuate. The eastern access road was gone, just mud and broken asphalt where it once curved into the hillside. By sunset, yellow tape surrounded the site. I watched from the porch of my cabin, Jasper curled against my leg, the smell of wet earth still thick in my nose. Helicopters circled overhead. Drones buzzed like flies. And somewhere beneath it all, the mountain settled into its new shape, bruised perhaps, but heard. The HOA released a public statement that evening. They called the incident an unexpected natural disaster. They thanked emergency responders, expressed gratitude that no lives were lost, and promised to investigate the underlying causes thoroughly. Not a single mention of the warnings they ignored. Not a word about the letters, the footage, the pleas. But that didn't matter anymore, because I had it all, every minute of it, in HD, backed up in triplicate, with timestamp signatures and interviews. And so did the press. And so did the state geologist's office. And now, whether they liked it or not, so did the public. Let them try to rewrite the narrative. This time, the mountain had proof. The day after the landslide, I woke to a kind of quiet I hadn't heard in months. Not the peaceful hush of nature, but the strained silence of a community trying to decide whether to face what had happened or bury it deeper than the mudslide itself. By 8 a.m., my phone was vibrating nonstop. Reporters, residents, even a few HOA members who'd once ignored me were now trying to call. I let most of them go to voicemail. I was tired not just in the body, but in the soul. My warnings had been dismissed until disaster made them undeniable. Now the people who'd rolled their eyes at me were crawling out of the woodwork like termites looking for a stable beam to cling to. But I didn't feel vindicated. I felt heavy. Still, I knew this moment mattered. I had to make sure the truth stuck before they tried to paint over it. At 10 a.m., Channel 4 ran a special report featuring clips from the footage I'd provided. The anchor's voice was steady, but behind her eyes was the unmistakable glimmer of unease. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Ignored Warnings, HOA Trail Project Crushed by Record Rainfall." They played the clip of the moment the slope cracked open, the very footage I had captured from the ridge. Then they cut to a shaky cell phone video from a neighboring house showing the backhoe getting swallowed whole. And then they aired the footage of Pamela, running, face-pale hair soaked, caught in the panic of the collapse she had pretended would never come. I wasn't proud to see her that way, but I was relieved, because there was no spinning that image. No press release could undo it. The HOA was no longer in control of the narrative. Melissa Chan interviewed me later that day on my porch. She arrived alone, no camera crew, just a voice recorder and a notebook. Her jacket was still damp from the mist. She asked careful, quiet questions, letting me lead the story rather than twisting it into headlines. "Did you ever expect it would go this far?" she asked. "I hoped it wouldn't," I said, "but I knew it could. What would you say to the people who dismissed your warnings?" I looked out at the ridge, what was left of it. "I'm not looking for an apology," I said. "I just want us to stop pretending that power makes people right. The earth doesn't care about votes or titles or board meetings. It responds to pressure, and eventually it breaks." She didn't interrupt. She just nodded and scribbled that line down. Later that evening, I received an unexpected email, a formal inquiry from the state's Department of Environmental Quality requesting access to my raw data camera footage and written documentation for use in a pending investigation. They were opening a case. The subject line was simple: HOA misconduct, request for expert documentation. It was finally happening. The board began to fracture within days. Tina Morales resigned, first citing mental exhaustion and concern for community trust. Her resignation letter was posted online and immediately leaked to the press. In it, she admitted that Pamela had ignored multiple internal concerns about safety, but insisted she had been pressured to go along with the majority. Greg Parsons went next. He didn't even issue a statement. He just disappeared. Someone posted a photo of a U-Haul parked outside his house, gone overnight. And then there was Pamela. She held on like a climber with no rope, releasing cryptic updates on the HOA website about restructuring efforts and our collective healing. But behind the curtain, she was scrambling. I knew because I received a letter from her attorney. They weren't threatening me this time. They were begging. The letter asked that I consider resolving any potential civil claims privately to preserve community morale, and offered a confidential mediation session with the HOA executive board. They wanted it buried. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it up, walked out to my fire pit, and dropped it into the flames. The wind carried the ashes toward the slope they tried to conquer. That week, a group of residents formed a recall committee. Not just against Pamela, against the entire HOA leadership. Turns out, I wasn't the only one they'd wronged. A veteran in the lower neighborhood revealed that Pamela had threatened to fine him for keeping a support flag up past the authorized display date. A single mother came forward with photos of her car being towed without warning for unauthorized overnight parking. Elderly homeowners described letters full of passive-aggressive demands and threats of liens over minor paint discoloration. The landslide had done more than expose geological instability. It had unearthed years of suppressed resentment. They called the movement Restore Westridge. It started with flyers and meetings at the community center. Then came yard signs, then door-to-door volunteers. In just under 3 weeks, the committee collected enough signatures to force a board-wide vote. Pamela tried to stall it. She filed a motion to invalidate the petition citing procedural errors. The county clerk rejected it. On the day of the vote, I stood in the back of the hall, arms crossed, not speaking, just watching. Over 200 residents showed up. That was more than had ever attended any HOA meeting in Westridge history. The vote wasn't even close. Pamela Voss was removed from her position by a margin of 179 to 16. The rest of the board followed suit. When the results were announced, there wasn't applause. Just a long collective exhale, like the entire community had been holding its breath for too long. I stepped outside and looked up toward the ridge. The land was still raw healing, but it would recover. The HOA, however, that would take much longer. The next morning, I got a knock at the door. It was Janet Fowler, the retired teacher who had once served on the board before Pamela rewrote the charter. She smiled and handed me a fresh-baked pie. "I figured you could use something sweet after all this," she said. I laughed. "It's been a while since anyone brought me pie." "You saved this place," she said softly. No, I replied, eyes drifting toward the trees. The mountain did. She looked out at the ridge, at the scars and torn soil, and nodded. Funny thing about mountains, she said. They never really belong to us, but they do. Remember, that night I sat on my porch with Jasper and watched the stars peek through the thinning clouds. For the first time in months, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel hunted. I didn't feel dismissed. I felt still, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm, the kind that feels like a beginning. The morning after the board was removed, I got a call from Eric Ramirez. They're ready for it, he said without even saying hello. I didn't have to ask what it meant. The investigation had finally crossed a threshold. What started as a passive review of the HOA's behavior was now a formal inquiry with legal authority funding and, more importantly, urgency. I loaded everything into the truck, 3 hard drives, a binder thicker than any I'd seen since my military years, printed photos, GPS logs, copies of every email I'd sent, and received, all organized chronologically with highlighted notes. I'd learned from experience that truth without structure could still be buried. So I made it easy to find. The drive to the state capitol took 4 hours. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed the quiet, needed the tires humming against the road to calm my nerves. There was something sobering about watching pine forests roll past their roots buried deep in soil more honest than people. Eric met me outside the Department of Environmental Quality building, an aging structure of concrete and glass that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the early 90s. His handshake was firm, familiar. He wore the same state-issued windbreaker I remembered from years ago, and his eyes, though a little more tired, were still clear. "You ready?" he asked. "Been ready since they ignored the first warning." He led me through security and into a conference room where 3 others waited: a state geologist, a lawyer from the Attorney General's office, and a woman from the Office of Public Integrity. I recognized her name. She had prosecuted several high-profile land misuse cases in the past decade. I placed the binder on the table and took a breath. "Everything is in there," I said. "And if that's not enough, I brought the footage." We spent the next 3 hours going through it all: footage of excavation near unstable zones, trail cam timestamps, footage of retaining walls collapsing before the landslide, drone captures of workers ignoring posted boundary signs, and of course the before and after topography overlays I'd compiled. They didn't interrupt much, just took notes. Occasionally, one would glance at another, eyebrows raised. When I showed them the HOA's cease and desist letter, the one that accused me of spreading alarmism, the lawyer actually laughed under his breath. When it was over, Eric stood up and patted the binder like it was a sleeping animal. "This is enough to trigger a multi-agency review," he said. "You might have just opened the floodgates." The woman from Public Integrity leaned forward. "Did you ever record any direct conversations with Ms. Voss or board members where they acknowledged what you'd told them?" I nodded. 2. One on video, the other on voice recorder, both included in the files. She smiled slightly. "That's the kind of thing that doesn't get buried in committee." I left the building with a strange mix of exhaustion and peace. It was out of my hands now, and yet it had never really been about holding it all. It had been about getting it somewhere safe, letting truth breathe before it was suffocated by PR statements and legal threats. By the time I got back to Westridge, things had already begun to shift. The newly elected HOA interim board, formed mostly of long-term residents and former volunteers, had voted to halt all development projects indefinitely. They also opened a public archive of all past HOA meeting minutes, including ones that had been suspiciously omitted from official newsletters. The archive exposed years of financial mismanagement, intimidation tactics, and backdoor deals. One document revealed that Pamela Voss had authorized over $300,000 in discretionary funds to contractors with personal ties, including the company responsible for the faulty retaining wall. Another exposed that a former board member had resigned in protest over early warnings, but had been forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Residents were livid. Some wanted to sue. Others just wanted to reclaim the community they thought they had. The new board formed listening sessions and neighborhood circles, simple meetings where people could share, vent, and rebuild trust. I was invited to one. I didn't want to go at first. I wasn't looking to be a hero. But Janet showed up on my porch with that no-nonsense look teachers get when you're about to skip homework. "You don't have to speak," she said. "Just be there." So I went. The meeting was held in the same rec hall where Pamela once stood beneath bright banners grinning for photos. Now the chairs were rearranged in a circle. No podium. No microphone. Just people, some of them embarrassed, others relieved. When I finally did speak, it wasn't angry. I didn't fight the HOA, I said. I fought for the mountain, and for the right to be heard before everything fell down around us. People nodded, some clapped quietly. Afterward, a young couple approached me, Eric and Danielle, new homeowners who had moved in just a year ago. They held their toddler on a hip and thanked me for protecting what they now saw as sacred land. I used to think HOA rules were just part of the deal, Eric said. Now I realize silence was the bigger threat. Danielle added, "You gave us back our voice." Their little boy reached out and pet Jasper, who leaned into the touch like he knew what it meant. Days passed. The Office of Public Integrity filed subpoenas for HOA records. Pamela Voss retained an attorney known for damage control. But word had gotten out. A local environmental group began petitioning to designate the ridge and surrounding slope as a protected natural area immune from future development. The petition gathered thousands of signatures in less than a week. Then came the call from the governor's office. Not the governor himself, his deputy environmental advisor. He asked if I would be willing to testify in a state hearing regarding HOA overreach and its potential environmental consequences. They were looking to revise land use policy across the state and needed first-hand testimony. I said yes. Not because I wanted to be in the spotlight, but because I knew how many others didn't have the chance. The quiet neighbors who had been fined into silence, the elderly man who lost his garage over a paint violation, the single mom whose rose bushes didn't match aesthetic standards. I'd fought for a mountain, but now maybe that mountain could fight for more than just itself. The state hearing was held 3 weeks later in a government building with bad lighting and coffee that tasted like recycled cardboard. But I wasn't there for comfort. I was there to speak. The room was packed, journalists, state officials, local activists, even a few retired HOA board members from other districts. I wore my best jacket not out of vanity, but respect. I brought 2 things with me: a thumb drive, with all the footage and evidence, and a photograph of my grandfather standing beside the cabin he built in 1960, holding a shovel and grinning like he'd just wrestled the mountain into giving him permission to stay. I placed the photo on the table before me, and when it was my turn, I stood. "I'm not a politician," I began, "and I'm not here to play one. My name is Franklin Hale. I'm a retired geological engineer, a veteran, and a homeowner. And for the past year, I've been in a fight not against bureaucracy, but against ignorance disguised as authority." I walked them through the story not in a rush, not like a witness report, but like a living memory. I spoke of how I warned them, how they dismissed the science, how they built anyway. I showed them the footage, the shearing slope, the collapse, the aftermath. Then I told them about the aftermath inside the community. The families displaced, the homes, threatened, the legal intimidation, the lies, the arrogance. They built a trail to unify the neighborhood, I said. But in doing so, they fractured everything. They ignored warnings, not because they weren't clear, but because they came from someone without a title. That line got quoted in 2 newspapers the next day. After I sat down, I looked over at the panel. They weren't just taking notes anymore. They were listening. The kind of listening that makes you lean forward and question what you thought you knew. The hearing concluded with a proposal to form a statewide commission reviewing HOA authority over land development, especially in areas bordering natural terrain. They invited me to serve as an advisor. I declined, not out of spite, but because I was ready to let go. I'd done my part. I went home that evening and stood at the edge of the rebuilt trail above the slope. The state had since declared the area an ecological hazard zone, closed to all future development. The new HOA board, humble or less glossy, had voted to allocate funds to reinforce the remaining trailheads and create an educational kiosk about the landslide with geological diagrams and historical photos of the ridge. They asked if they could include a plaque with my name on it. I told them no, but I offered a suggestion. "Name the ridge after my grandfather," I said. "He's the one who respected it first." Weeks passed. The season shifted. Grass began to regrow on the raw face of the mountain. Wildflowers, fireweed mostly sprang up defiantly where machines once clawed. Nature, as always, was healing in spite of us. One morning, I woke to a knock on my door. It was Melissa Chan again, holding a copy of her newly published feature article. The Mountain That Spoke How One Man's Warning Changed a State. She smiled. "You're a reluctant legend now." I laughed. "I'd rather just be a quiet man with a dog and a working rain gauge." She left me a signed copy anyway. That afternoon, I took Jasper for a long walk up the ridge. We passed the spot where the first backhoe had cut into the earth now covered in moss. The sky was calm. Birds moved between branches. The air smelled clean. At the top, I stood by the new sign the HOA had installed. Hale Ridge Protected Natural Zone. Dedicated in memory of Bernard Hale, 1926 to 1999. I closed my eyes and let the wind pass over me. I imagined him beside me, hands on hips, surveying the land with that quiet pride only a man who dug with calloused fingers could feel. And I smiled. Because in the end, the mountain didn't belong to any of us. But it did remember who listened. And it rewarded those who fought for it with silence, the good kind. The kind that fills your lungs with something deeper than air. Something like peace. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch with Jasper snoring at my feet. I made myself a cup of tea, not coffee this time, and opened the window to let the evening drift in. A new family had moved into one of the homes down the hill. They waved when they passed me on their morning walks. Kids laughed on the gravel road again. And for the first time in months, the HOA was no longer a threat, but a group of neighbors relearning what community actually meant. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was watching quietly, like the mountain always had. And finally, the land was still,